1875. They've already proven their value on the South London line, when finally also the New Cross depot at the East London line received their fair share of Stroudley's Class A. And among those locomotives sent factory new to New Cross was also number 55, Stepney. When William Stroudley took office as a new locomotives, carriages and wagons superintendent for the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway in 1870, one of the most urgent matters was to replace the more than outdated rolling stock used for the London suburban lines. Modern and powerful locomotives were needed for those services, but for the sake of low running costs they should be all of the same class. And last but certainly not least, the track, especially at the South London line, was very lightly late, if not to say in quite bad condition, so the new locomotive class would also need to be very lightweight. But it takes no engineer to see that some of these requirements kinda contradict each other, so not any locomotive design would do, but one drawn up to the finest of standards where no detail is left to chance. And unsurprisingly, these even back then tiny locomotives quickly became the talk of the press and changed London for good. These new locomotives managed to pull up to 13 two-axled coaches, managed just fine with the steep inclines around the Thames Tunnel, and could be seen reaching about 100 km per hour top speed. Even though the top speed really wasn't that important, considering its duties, what was important for that class was to have a lot of bite, to accelerate fast and to come equally fast to a halt. And all of that while also being super cheap to run. And maybe due to those characteristics, or maybe to a comment Stroudley himself made, they became quickly known as terriers, even though their crews preferred to call them routers or pups. However, just those locomotives on their own wouldn't quite cut it. Also the carriages needed to be replaced. And to help with the heavy suburban trains, these coaches were as lightweight as a wooden coach can be. You see why the general construction of these coaches is similar to any other old wooden Victorian coach. The suburban sets were close coupled, saving both on weight as well as on length, with only the outer ends of each consist having buffers and a regular coupling. And with these smart new trains, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway really set a new standard. However, braking was a bit of an issue. When the Terriers were introduced in 72, the London and Brighton had not yet decided which continuous brake system to use. So when the first batches of Terriers were delivered, they had no air or vacuum pumps, no brake pipes, and just regular 3-link couplings. Also the coaches did not have any brakes except for the brake carriages at both ends. But an even bigger braking issue was that while the Terriers always had two brake systems, the handbrake and a steam brake, the latter one was very aggressive. Which is good if you want to bring the train to a halt, but not very good in terms of ride comfort, so crews pretty soon settled down on just using the handbrake, which must have been quite adventurous. But despite those initial imperfections, those new Terrier consists were much better than what London had before, and the tragic flip side of that coin is that those suburban trains became so popular due to the Terriers, that those trains grew heavier and heavier, and eventually the Terriers which made them so successful were simply too weak for them. And as gradually the permanent way was improved, heavier locomotives could and would be employed for those routes. And with that, in 1901, Stepney was put on the duplicate list. And while at face value that only meant that the Terriers' numbers were raised by 600, so the lower numbers would be available for new locomotives, giving Stepney now the number 655, being duplicate listed would usually be fairly quickly followed up by being put on the surplus list before being withdrawn. So in 1904 Stepney left London for Brighton, where she either served as a station pilot or served the Camptown branch. And as expected, already the year later, Stepney along with many other Terriers was marked for withdrawal. But the Terrier success story had only just begun. In face of the competition by electric trams, the London and Brighton introduced a new motor train service. one terrier coupled up to one boogie coach. Fitted with the respective equipment, the driver could control the train from the coach, so there was no need anymore to run around the locomotive at a terminal station. And in 1907 also Stepney received motor train equipment. And alongside also her cylinders were decreased in size from 14 inches in diameter to just 12, and she was refitted with condensing gear, which she originally lost in 1894 when her first set of 13-inch cylinders was replaced with 14-inch ones. The purpose of that condensing gear is to use the exhaust steam to preheat the water in the tanks, which made them even more economic to run. And in that modified condition she would return to London to the West Croydon shed. She would even return to New Cross in 1911. And talking about a strong comeback, the year after, she would even become more powerful, as in 1912 she would receive a new and larger boiler. And with that she no longer belonged to the A1 class, the 1 was added in 1905 by the way, but rather to the A1X class. At that point she had already lost her original improved engine green livery in favor for the umber brown, and her name in favor for just the company markings. But that being said, crews still refer to her as Stepney. However, when she was hired by the military railway in Longmoor in 1920, she left London for good. While she would return from Longmoor in the same year, she was now stationed at Fratton, where she would do pretty much whatever came her way. Working the Hayling Island branch with its fragile wooden viaduct, work as a shunter, or from time to time being hired by the Canton East Success Railway, in particular during the hop picking season. But often, she would also just be stored away. And it is at that point Stepney would receive a plethora of different liveries and numbers. So with the grouping in 1923, the umber brown would give way for the Southern Railway's olive green. Originally a B was added to her running number indicating a Brighton machine, but that was soon replaced by a 2. In 1939 she received malachite green, and following the nationalization, in 1949 she received finally BR's lined passenger black with yet another new number by adding a leading 3. However, about her working grounds, nothing really changed, except that in the following years more and more branch lines were closed down, and more terriers piled up in Fratton. Eventually the Fratton depot closed, so the remaining terriers were sent to Eastleigh, where Stepney in 1959 would even receive a new boiler, which must have been quite a surprise, but a very lucky surprise indeed. In the same year, British Railways was approached by a group of enthusiasts. There was one terrier the big railway could spare, and with that Stepney should become in 1960 the first locomotive of the Bluebell Railway. And while the Bluebell would receive many more locomotives in the following years, including another terrier, it is Stepney who received her own book in 1963, when Wilbert Awdry dedicated a whole volume of his railway series to her. And now as the face of the Bluebell Railway, and as a once prominent character of a soon very big franchise, it is now, in pretty much her third life, that Stepney started to become a household name. So much in fact that even her historically inaccurate condition on the Bluebell Railway as an A1X in the original improved engine green livery became an icon in its own right. However, the fate from her first career kinda repeated itself on the Bluebell. Even though she was a perfect locomotive to begin with, the soon following success of the Bluebell Railway meant that more powerful locomotives were necessary. But despite all of that, Stepney is still a mainstay, and was just slightly more than 150 years young, there's no doubt that she will continue to impress for many more generations yet to come. But that's just the story of Stepney. Due to the versatility, there are plenty of different stories to be told from the 50 locomotives that were built. Well, 58 if you were to include the Australian ones, which were almost identical. But it's also the versatility which led to their long working lives. And those long careers in turn helped 10 out of the 50 machines built into preservation, which is a respectable number for any class, but an outstanding one for a class of that vintage. And with that, a big thank you goes to our supporters who make videos like these possible and allow me to say, see you next time!